What is good, everybody? This is TAETRO, and welcome back to another chapter of the Ableton Live for Beginners series. This is already the 8th chapter in this series, and I hope you've been enjoying it. I've been seeing a lot of you in the comments making huge strides using Ableton Live, and that's really our goal here. I want you to be able to go from knowing nothing about using this DAW to being able to create your own music within it. I hope you're finding these tutorials really approachable and well explained. I'm always looking to hear from you in the comments to let me know some feedback, let me know how it's going with you creating an Ableton Live, and let me know where we want to go next with this series. Today's video is going to be sponsored by DistroKid, but I'll tell you more about them a little later. And just so you know, if this is the first chapter you're finding, we are going to be building on all the previous episodes, so it is worth it to go back to the first chapter and build yourself up to this one. And I've got a link to the full playlist in the description down below. But let's kick things off by talking about track defaults and templates. What does that even mean? Well, first of all, when I open up Ableton Live, this is what it looks like. This is how we've basically been starting in every episode of this series. We've got 2 MIDI tracks, 2 audio tracks. They've got no audio effects on them. We've got reverb and delay tracks. Everything is looking pretty standard. But you might boot up Ableton Live and never use these audio tracks. And you might boot up Ableton Live and maybe you're always putting a specific device, like maybe an EQ, right? Maybe you're always EQing an instrument and you just put an EQ on all your tracks. Well, instead of doing this every single time and wasting our lives, wasting precious minutes of music making time every single time, we can actually set default MIDI and default audio tracks, as well as our default template for Ableton Live. So that's what we're going to do right now. And I'm going to make a couple suggestions to you as we do this. First, to just touch on track defaults, a slept on device here is Utility, which I think we did talk about in a previous chapter. This is a device that can help us do some very basic things to our tracks, like adjust the gain, adjust the panning, adjust the width, turn something into mono, bass mono, etc., which you might say, well, why not do all of that just in the track mixer? And one of the reasons is because of automation, which we also talked about in a previous chapter. But let's say I'm working on a big track and I want to have my mixer section free and clear. I want to be able to adjust the general level of an audio track or a MIDI instrument for the whole track. Within that track, I want there to be some automation over time. Well, if I go into arrangement view really quick here and I automate the track volume of this track, right? This is a blank track, but right now the volume on it will change over time. We'll see that happen. Now I can no longer just quickly grab this volume meter and bring down this track a couple dBs if I need to in mixing, because then it just takes over and the automation goes away. So it's always better, I'm going to delete that automation, to automate the utility gain instead. Now, if I do this and I add some random automation here throughout my track, great. That all can still happen as needed. However, if in mixing, I'm like, oh, this track is a little bit too soft in general, let me bring it up 2 dB. Boom, I can do that, but I've still maintained the automation that I need for whatever reason within the track, right? So all that is to say, utility is a great thing to have automatically on any of your tracks, your MIDI or your audio tracks. Now, I also have some other things that I put on my tracks by default. I'll talk about that in a minute, but first let me just show you how to make a track default. And it's really simple. We're going to right click on the MIDI track that has whatever default effects we want on there, right click, and go to Save as Default MIDI Track. This will also work for audio tracks. You can right click on an audio track and click Save as Default Audio Track. Now, I'm not actually going to click this right now. Instead, what I'm going to do is right now just do Command-Shift-T to insert a new MIDI track and watch what happens. As you can see, just by inserting a new MIDI track, actually I can even hit Command-T, which will create a new audio track. You can see that these both loaded by default with an audio effects rack on it. Now, this is a custom audio effects rack that I built, and I have a whole video on it that I will link in the description, and also it'll pop up at the top of the screen here. And I'm not going to fully explain it here other than to say it contains an EQ, a reverb, and a compressor. The other thing here in the track defaults is the utility, as I just kind of explained. It's a really good thing just to have on all of your tracks. And what this does is it just speeds up my workflow. I found that for a lot of the music I was making, most of the tracks had some type of compression, some type of EQing, and some type of reverb, or at least I was most likely to use those. So now, anytime I load up any track, before I even get started, it's got those things. And I've mapped some macros here so I can do low cuts and high cuts. Again, full video on this rack if you're more curious about it. I'll link it in the description. So that'll save you some time. Once you figure out how your track defaults should be, just right click, save as MIDI track default or save as audio track default. Then in any project, you insert a new audio track or a MIDI track, it'll show up just like that. But make sure it's exactly how you want it, because say if we had the gain turned up 14, 15 dB or had some crazy wacky settings, if I hit save default audio track, it's going to save with those settings we just dialed in. That's why this rack that I currently have is kind of at a 0 state when we first insert the track. You can do that at any time. Save as default on both MIDI and audio tracks. And now we talked about this at the beginning, but let's talk about templates, because the truth is, my friends, I've been lying to you. Every time we've booted up Ableton Live in this series, it has looked close to what you have with your Ableton Live by default. And that's because I know many of you are beginners and I want it to look the same. 2 MIDI tracks, 2 audio tracks, and it automatically loads in session view. However, if I go to File, New Live Set, as many of you can, and it'll probably look exactly how it does now again. But if I do it, here's what happens. Well, it does not look like that. It actually looks quite different. I'm just going to hide the library here. First of all, we've loaded up in arrangement view, because I mostly work in arrangement view. And the tracks that we have available here, there's quite a few different tracks other than your typical 2 MIDI 2 audio. And this is something that I've built and have continued to tweak and build over the course of, my music making career. But all I've done here is built a default template that gets me up and running and has most of the options that I kind of need ready and there for me as soon as I open up Ableton Live. So having a drum rack, but then also having a group that is meant for drums if I want to work with drums in audio instead of as a drum rack. A separate audio track that could be used for percussion. That's why these are all yellow. Some simpler tracks for easy sampling. We did that last time in the last chapter. A complete control, which allows me to boot up any native instruments plugins that I most commonly use. Empty MIDI tracks, and then empty audio tracks. So I'm in arrangement view. I've got this specific set of tracks here that I've set by default. And then even if I expand one of these tracks, you're going to notice that most of these tracks here are in here at -12 dB, when usually your default mixer settings would be at 0. Now, why did I set that to -12 dB? Well, it's because I'm always preparing my music to have a lot of headroom so that it can be mastered and it can be nice and loud, which seems counterintuitive probably. Why would we turn the tracks down if we want them to be nice and loud? As it turns out, headroom is really, really important for getting a loud sound in the end. So if I could make a suggestion to you, it would be to build up a live set, a blank live set that has the things you most commonly use. The MIDI tracks, if it's a simpler, if you use a specific plugin, which we'll talk about plugins here at the end. If you're always using a drum rack, or if you're working with drums as samples in a kit, whatever it may be, build up that blank template. Think about setting the default state of your volumes to something below 0. It doesn't have to be extreme as -12, but for mixing, I find that that's helpful for me. And once you've got that default state, remember, everything's going to save here, even your tempo, even being on arrangement view or being on session view. Whatever it is, set it exactly how you want it every time you want to open up Ableton Live. And then go to File, Save Live Set as Default Set. That means every time you open up Ableton Live, it's going to look like this and get you up and running a lot faster. Notice that we also have the option to save live set as template, and that's because you can save templates that aren't necessarily your default template. Like if you have a singer-songwriter setup and then you have an EDM setup, maybe you have 2 different templates for those things, you can always do that and they'll be saved here under templates. You can see that I've got a few iterations of different templates here, but you can also see my TAETRO default templates, which has changed over time, which is why there are multiple copies. Don't be afraid to tweak this as you go, keep it simple, and think about what's going to help you work faster. Okay, on the note of working faster, I want you to notice something else here over on the left. We have certain ways of organizing things within Ableton Live. Of course, we have the default stuff like instruments, drums, audio effects, MIDI effects. We've learned a lot about those in previous chapters. But what about these things? Collections. And how about the user library? How does that come into play? This is another thing that's going to help you work a lot faster, and it's also going to help you kind of refine your sound as an artist. So if we jump up here to collections, you'll see I have different categories, but let's go into instruments for now. And what the instruments collection holds is kind of just a bunch of custom instruments that I've made across different projects, but they're instruments that I'd like to use again in the future. So for instance here, I just made this instrument one day in a project and I thought, maybe I don't need to just use this instrument in that project. And I thought, oh, this would be a good instrument to use across different tracks, not just this one project. So I decided to save it. Same thing with Saikai's flute here. Shout out to Saikai, great community member, producer. She is dope. But this thing loads up with a bunch of complicated stuff we'll talk about later in a minute. But anytime I want to use this flute sound, I can instantly bring it up in any project. It's not just lost in some other project. So if you think about the last chapter, how we were creating sample instruments, you might have created your own sample instrument and you might say, I want to use this all the time. And as you do that, let's say here in this simpler instrument, you created a really epic sound, Let's say you want to keep that and store it away for later. Well, first, let's drop it into the user library. You can create folders in this and create an instruments folder within this as well, but I just find this is an easy workflow thing. Okay, now that really epic sound is in our user library, you can right click on it and basically tag it so that it belongs to a collection. So we could tag it and put it in our instruments collection. And now, really epic sound is there along with our other custom sounds. You can do this for anything. So even here tagged yellow, I've tagged 2 plugins that I use commonly as yellow so I can quickly grab them. I don't have to dive into this plugins folder. And if you're like, what the heck is this plugins folder? Don't worry about it. That's the last thing we're going to talk about today. I even have it for effects. So if I have a mastering chain of effects, which I do, I have it saved here, I can always just click, grab that, and drop it in. I don't have to build it every time. I've built it once. I'll tweak it on different projects, but by default, it's right there in my collections. So that's easy enough. As you build things that work for you, save them into your collections. Then just take a quick look at places here. You might not be utilizing this as best that you can, but if you see, I have a bunch of different folders added here. And what this essentially is, you can add any folder here, any folder on your computer. So if you want something like your desktop there, or like, hey, this is a podcast that I work on, so let me go ahead and add a shortcut here in places for that. And now the folder is here. I can go ahead and jump in here when I'm working on this podcast and grab something. Oh, maybe Daltrix sent me a bunch of samples. Great, I've added that folder to places and I can quickly grab that across any of the projects that I'm in. My field recordings are here, so I can quickly grab those and drop those in any project. It makes things really, really easy. But one little pro tip here is that you can also combine different Ableton Live projects or parts of different Ableton Live projects. So if I go to the recordings folder, which is where I save all of my projects, right? If I go there and I open up or expand a previous project, what you'll see here is not only is the live set here, like our Ableton Live file, but all of the individual tracks are also there. So let's say, oh, I really liked that kit that I used in that other track. Let me drop it into this project. I can do that so easily. It's actually going to drop all the info, not just the kit that I made, but it'll also drop in like any MIDI or audio in the case of audio, and you can easily do that. So utilize your places just to stay organized, but also think about how you can jump between your different projects or pull different elements from your different projects and include them in your new project. Okay, so that's the workflow stuff, creating your track default so that every time you insert a new track, it loads exactly the way you want it to. Creating your own live default set, file, save live set as default set, so that as soon as you open up Ableton Live, you're off and running exactly how you want it to be. And staying organized with your collections, building up your user library of sounds and things that you frequently use. Also being smart about places and adding quick shortcuts to folders you often use across different projects. The next thing I want to show you is those things we pull in from outside Ableton Live. Where do people get all those crazy cool samples from? What about plugins? What the heck is a VST? We're going to talk all about that after I tell you about today's video sponsor, DistroKid. DistroKid is the easiest way for you to get your music in all the important places. That's Spotify, Apple Music, even TikTok. Their motto is be prolific, which is why I signed up for DistroKid way before they were ever a sponsor on this channel, and I've been using them ever since I've been releasing music. You pay one annual subscription fee and can upload as much music to all these places as you want throughout the year. But they also have a ton of fun features for their artists, which I've been taking you through over the past chapters of this series, so let's check out another one today. Okay, today's feature is all about getting yourself heard. So if we go to Get Heard Now, we will see Playlist Spotlight. What is this all about? Well, actually, DistroKid has a bunch of huge playlists with hundreds of thousands of followers. And as a DistroKid artist, you can get on them. You can submit any one of your tracks to go head to head with other DistroKid artists. And then your tracks go head to head and you can vote on which track you like from a specific artist. Anybody can vote and you can share a link with your fans, friends, family to vote for your track. You can submit one track at a time, there's only one vote per person, and every week the votes are reset to 0 and the playlists are updated. There's also this fun thing called Wheel of Playlists, which is a playlist all by itself where you can pick one of your songs, spin the wheel, and your best of 3 spins determines your spot on the playlist. So we're hoping for that low number, towards the top. Oh, did you see that? Okay. So now my playlist is on here. It's at position 1937. You can probably go listen to it now, but it'll get knocked off the wheel by the time this video is out. But you can always take a chance, spin the wheel yourself. And I guess the point is that DistroKid offers these ways for their artists to get heard by building these really cool playlists that you can also just give a follow if you're looking for a cool new playlist to discover new music on, whether it's the general spotlight one, the wheel of playlists, or the genre specific playlists. So if you want to sign up for DistroKid, take advantage of the fun, cool features they offer to their artists, but also just get your music out on all the platforms where you need to get it. Use my link in the description, you get a 7% off discount, and if you support the sponsor, it supports the channel. All right, back into learning about Ableton Live. Okay, so 2 things left here to talk about. Number 1 is samples, and number 2 is VSTs and plugins. What the heck does that even mean? Let's start with samples because it's easy enough. If you've tuned in to a live stream of mine, or if you've seen a tutorial where I'm making music, you might have seen me do something like this. I jump up to my top bar here, I load up a second window of some sort. Usually I'll be grabbing sounds from this window and dropping them into the project that I'm working on. This is a sample library, and this particular sample library and application that I'm using is called Splice. There are a number of these. They're usually subscription based, so these are paid things, which is why I don't want to spend too much time on them, but they do go hand in hand with music creation in Ableton Live if you're pulling from other sample libraries. They're basically just giant libraries of samples that you can download. You usually get a certain amount of credits per month and you can download that many samples. This one is Splice. Another one I use is called Lander. They all essentially work the same way. Credit based, you can download that many samples. I'm constantly using them to pull in different sounds and just search these massive libraries. Okay, and finally plugins, which some of you have probably already stumbled into the world of plugins yourself. I know there's lots of creators out there that do like a weekly video about free plugins, and we're going to talk about some free plugins today. But what the heck are plugins? What's a VST? How does this all work? Why does it matter? Well, previously in this, we've either created our own instruments with samples or we've dug into Ableton Live's library of instruments, which they're all fine and good, but they might not be the exact sounds we want to use. And there's lots of other people out there besides Ableton creating virtual instruments. And that's essentially what a VST can be. It can be a virtual instrument. It can be an audio effect. Like we've got EQs in here, we've got reverbs in here, but guess what? There's other people out there making EQs and reverbs and compressors and delays, and they all are different in their own ways. So if I go to the plugins category over here in the library, I have these 3 categories, AU V2, VST, and VST3. Now I'm on a Mac, so that's why I'm seeing AU. If you don't see it, don't freak out. Then there's VST and VST3. VST3 is newer. I guess the recommendation for anybody is to be using VST3 as long as they are stable, or audio units on a Mac are also stable. However, you won't be able to cross between Windows and Mac if you're using audio units. Blah, blah, blah. What are these things anyway? Well, if I just open up the VST3 folder, you're going to see a bunch of different names of different companies. These are all different companies that create plugins, whether it's instruments or effects. If I open up Arturia, for instance, you're going to see a vast collection of their amazing, vintage modeled plugins. And these are all very, very big and fancy. I'm going to show you all some free stuff in one moment. But as you can see, I clicked and dragged that in, and we get this Jupiter 8 plugin with, you guessed it, sounds modeled from the popular vintage synthesizer. I might drop in an effect like EFX Fragments, which is an effect by Arturia, which can help transform a sound. Obviously, these effects and instruments look very different than what has been provided to us already from Ableton and the Ableton library. So plugins are a gateway into a world of an expanded set of sounds, an expanded set of tools created by all sorts of different people. I'd like to show you a free collection by Spitfire Audio called Labs, which will get into where do these plugins even live, how do I even get them into Ableton Live, all that. So as I dropped the Labs instrument in, it loads up with this first preset sound, which is kind of cool. But there's lots of other instruments within Labs, right? We've got piano, I've got a soft piano sound, and these sounds are all free. And here's how this works, and it can get a little bit crazy with plugins, especially if you start downloading a lot. But usually each one of these companies has some type of software hub, or some type of hub that holds all of their plugins. For instance, if I go to my bar here at the bottom, my dock, I can open up the Spitfire Audio hub that I have here, and this gives me access to their paid plugins as well as the Labs instruments, which are all free. So you can download this Spitfire Audio Hub at their website. I'll leave a link in the description for that. And you can install one of these many free libraries that they have here. Let's install one right now just for fun. Astral Forms, that sounds cool. Now, as you can see, it's going to tell me like, oh, we're going to download this and we're going to save it somewhere. This is very important because as you're getting set up, you want to make sure your plugins are all going to the same place so that Live knows where to pull them all from. And most of these plugin hubs have a way to do that. But let me just open up Live's preferences to show you that we do indeed need to tell Ableton Live where to find these plugins. And usually there's a default place to find these. If I go to plugins, we're going to see a list of all these different types, VST2, VST3, as well as audio units. Now, I don't have any custom folder set because I'm just letting the computer pick where to put these. And as long as all the different companies, whether it be Spitfire or Native Instruments or Arturia, as long as they're all putting the plugins into the same place, Ableton Live will know where to find them. So it is worth knowing where the heck is this going by default. If I bring up a Finder window here, go onto my hard drive, library, audio. This is of course on Mac. I will find a plugins folder. We will see a list of all different types of things. Components are where my audio units are, VST and VST3. We can see there's a bunch of files in there with all the different names of the different instruments we'd expect to find. We don't need to touch this. We just need to make sure that in any of our plugin hubs, any of these programs that the plugin providers make us download, we just need to make sure that within the settings of all these hubs, and they'll all look different, but they'll all have a setting to change where they're saving the plugins to. We need to check that first. VST2 install location, VST3 install location, AU install location. We see that that's all here. That's all set to the default folder, so I'm fine. I just want to make sure that when I go install my Arturia plugins now or my Native Instruments plugins, that they're all going to the same place. And if for some reason you install a plugin, but you had Live open and you can't find it, just make sure that you try to rescan first. You can always rescan, it'll rescan those plugin folders and look for what you just recently installed. So remember, we downloaded something called Astral Forms. Now I'm willing to bet that we probably need to put Labs on this track again because it needs to kind of, refresh what we have available to us. If I scroll down my list here, we will find Astral Forms with all the presets. So that's something that we literally just installed. And one quick last thing here. You'll see that when I opened up the VST folder and I went into, say, the Arturia folder, it showed all the individual instruments, But then it also shows something called Analog Lab, which is the final thing to touch on here because a lot of the plugin companies do the same thing. They often have all their individual instruments, but then like Native Instruments, for instance, they usually have these plugins that serve as hubs or homes of all the other plugins that they have. All the plugins in one place, essentially. So if I open up Complete Control, I see under Native Instruments, I have all these different plugins from Native Instruments, all these different sounds. Same goes for Analog Lab by Arturia. Analog Lab isn't an instrument in itself, it's a hub for all the different instrument plugins that Arturia makes. That's essentially what Labs is. Again, this is the free one. Go download all the sounds now, but it is a hub for all the free Labs sounds by Spitfire Audio. So hopefully that makes sense as you start to dive into the world of plugins. You want to make sure they're installed in the proper place. Usually they do that on their own, but if you experience problems, that's what you need to check first. And they commonly organize in the same way with large hub plugins that contain a bunch of different instruments. That combined with some of the sample libraries we just talked about, that's how you start to expand the world of Ableton Live beyond just the defaults of what is already included in the instruments, in the audio effects, etc. of Ableton's, default package. So hopefully in this 8th chapter of the Ableton Live for Beginners series, you were able to learn some things that speed up your workflow and help you start to think about the world outside of just what Ableton has provided us. If you did find this video helpful, please leave a comment down below, give this video a thumbs up on your way out, and don't forget to check out our sponsor DistroKid. You can save 7% off a DistroKid account, which can help you get your music out to all the important places as you start to create your own in Ableton Live. But for now, that is going to be it. Thank you all so much for watching. Tune in for the next one. This has been TAETRO. Have a good one.